Every Friday afternoon for 12 years, I brought Arthur Vance a black coffee and a single sheet of hand-drawn notes before our 4 o'clock design review. And every Friday afternoon for 12 years, he thanked me by name before he looked at either one. That is the whole story, if you want it in a single sentence. In 12 years, Arthur Vance and I never once closed the door between us. Not literally, not metaphorically, not even by accident, because somewhere in the second year I worked for him, he made a promise to a woman who was no longer alive to hold him to it, and I never once asked him to break it. My name is Elena Ross. I am 34 years old, and I live in Boston, where I have worked as an architect for the past 12 years. The last 6 of them as a senior associate at Vance & Sterling, a firm with exactly one name on the letterhead that mattered to me. I should tell you how this began in order, because the order is the only thing that makes any of it make sense, and because if I skip straight to the dinner, to the phone call, you will think this is a story about revenge. It never was. It was always a story about restraint, and about what 12 years of restraint finally cost, and finally revealed. Before I go further, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from, and what does the evening look like outside your window right now? I find myself curious, lately, about how far a quiet story like this one actually travels. I grew up in a suburb outside Philadelphia, the younger of 2 daughters born to a schoolteacher and a plumbing contractor, in a family that measured love mostly by attendance. You showed up, you smiled through dinner, and you did not discuss anything uncomfortable above a whisper. My older sister, Miriam, built her entire adult identity around being the daughter who showed up loudest, the one who married early, hosted every holiday, and narrated the family's story back to itself in a way that always cast her as its quiet hero. I built mine, without quite meaning to, around being the daughter who left. I left for architecture school at 22, and I have spent every year since trying to build something permanent out of drawings that used to just be lines on a page. Miriam and I were never close in the way sisters in other families seem to be. She was 3 years older, sharper-tongued, and had a gift for making any room believe whatever version of events she offered first. Growing up, if I helped our mother can vegetables all August so we'd have enough for winter, Miriam would mention the effort to relatives as though she'd organized the whole operation. If I stayed up late helping her study for a chemistry exam she was about to fail, she'd tell our father the next morning that she'd finally figured it out on her own. I stopped correcting these small rewrites of reality sometime around 16, mostly because correcting them always seemed to cost me more socially than simply letting them stand. I carried that same instinct with me into adulthood, and it is, I think now, part of the reason 12 years of silence about Arthur Vance felt so natural to maintain. I had already spent a lifetime being the sister who didn't need her contributions announced. There's one memory from that era that I think about often now, because it explains something about why I was drawn to Arthur's particular kind of quiet decency before I ever met him. When I was 15, our father's plumbing business nearly failed during a slow winter, and for about 4 months, money in our house was tighter than either of my parents ever admitted out loud. I noticed, without being told, that my mother had stopped buying herself the specific brand of tea she liked, the one that came in a yellow box, and had switched to a cheaper store brand without comment. I started using my babysitting money to quietly restock that yellow box in the pantry every few weeks, never saying anything, letting her think the store had simply started carrying it again. She never found out it was me until years later, when I mentioned it in passing during a different conversation entirely, and she cried for a full minute at the kitchen table before she could say anything back. I think, looking back, that I had always understood care as something that worked best when nobody had to acknowledge it in the moment. Arthur Vance, without either of us ever discussing it, seemed to understand exactly the same thing. I was 22, fresh out of a 5-year architecture program, when I interviewed for a junior drafting position at a mid-sized firm on the waterfront district of Boston. Arthur Vance was 46 then, already a name people said with a certain kind of respect in that industry, a senior partner who had built half the interesting buildings in 3 surrounding counties, and had a reputation for being exacting, patient, and almost entirely private. He hired me on the strength of a single sketch I'd done of a footbridge, a project that had nothing to do with the job posting, because, he told me later, anyone can learn a program. I wanted to see if you could still see. The firm's power gap was not subtle, and I want to name it plainly, the way it was always plain to both of us. He was my boss. He was 24 years older than me. He had been widowed 3 years before I arrived. His wife, Eleanor, had died of ovarian cancer after a 2-year illness during which, everyone at the firm told me eventually, he had barely left her side, taking every meeting from a hospital cafeteria if he had to. He had not dated anyone in the 3 years since. He had not, as far as I ever knew, dated anyone in the 9 years after that, either. I want to be honest about something else, too. Because the format of stories like this often glosses over it, I was aware, from nearly my first month at the firm, that whatever I felt toward him was complicated by exactly the kind of imbalance that makes those feelings worth examining rather than simply indulging. He signed my performance reviews. He decided which projects I was staffed on. If I had ever acted on what I felt in those early years, it would have meant putting my entire career in the hands of a man who could never have separated the personal request from the professional consequence, however well-intentioned either of us might have been. I think, looking back, that this awareness was part of what let the tension build so slowly and so safely over 12 years, instead of collapsing into something messier in year 1. Neither of us was naive about what the imbalance meant. Both of us, I believe now, were quietly grateful that neither of us tried to test it while it still mattered most. Our routine began simply enough. Every Friday, the two of us reviewed the week's drawings alone in his corner office, because he believed, correctly, I've since learned, training my own juniors, that criticism landed better one-on-one than in a room full of people waiting to see who got praised. I brought him coffee, because the first week I worked there, I noticed he forgot to eat lunch on Fridays, buried in deadlines. And I decided, quietly, that this was a small thing I could fix without being asked. He started thanking me by name before he even looked at the coffee, which became, over the years, a kind of ritual neither of us ever discussed out loud. Small motifs, if you want to call them that, a coffee order, a Friday hour, a particular blue pencil he only used for structural notes, one he'd apparently owned since architecture school himself and refused to replace even after the company started supplying newer ones. The tension built the way these things always build, in rooms too small for anyone to name what was happening out loud. There was a night, 18 months in, when we were the last 2 people in the office before a deadline. And he looked up from a rendering at close to 11 and said, "You should go home, Elena. I don't want to be the reason you burn out at 23. I told him I wasn't tired. He held my gaze a half-second longer than the sentence required, and then looked back down at the drawing, and neither of us mentioned it again. There was another night, 2 years after that, when I was crying quietly in the stairwell after a difficult phone call with my mother. And he found me there, not by accident, I think, though he never said so, and sat down on the step below mine without a word, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his shoulder without either of us closing the last few inches between us, and stayed until I stopped shaking. My coworker Chloe Diaz, who sat 2 desks from mine for 9 years, was the one who finally said the thing out loud that everyone else only implied. It was after the office holiday party, my 4th year at the firm, and she'd had exactly one glass of wine too many. "Does he know?" she asked me, point blank, in the coat closet. "Does he know that you'd say yes if he ever asked?" I told her there was nothing to know, that he was my boss and a friend, and that was the whole of it. She looked at me the way people look at you when they've decided not to argue with a lie out of kindness rather than belief, and said, "Okay, Elena," and never brought it up again. Not once. In 5 more years of sitting 2 desks away. There was a smaller motif I haven't mentioned yet, one that mattered more to me over the years than almost anything else. Every year, on the anniversary of my hiring, Arthur left a single yellow legal pad on my desk before I arrived in the morning, always the same brand, never a note attached, never any explanation. The first year, I assumed it was simply an oversight from the supply closet. By the 3rd year, I understood it for what it was, a private, wordless acknowledgement of a date he clearly still tracked, delivered in a form so understated that no one else in the office would ever have noticed it as a gesture at all. I kept every single one of those legal pads, blank pages included, in a drawer at home I never showed anyone. I never asked him why he did it. I think some part of me understood that asking would have turned a quiet ritual into a conversation neither of us was ready to have. The nearest either of us came to naming it directly, before the parking lot conversation years later, happened during a site visit to a half-finished community center on the South End, my 5th year at the firm. We were alone in the unfinished lobby, checking sightlines against the drawings, when a sudden July storm trapped us there for almost 2 hours, the two of us sitting on overturned buckets in a building with no working lights, listening to rain hit plywood where windows would eventually go. He told me, in the dark, about the year after Eleanor died. How he'd nearly sold the firm rather than keep showing up to an office that reminded him of a life he'd expected to have 20 more years of. He said hiring me, watching me learn, had been the first thing in 3 years that had made the work feel like it mattered again, rather than like something he was simply enduring. I told him, carefully, that working for him had done something similar for me, given a shape and a discipline to a career I might otherwise have drifted through without direction. Neither of us said more than that. When the rain stopped, we packed up the drawings and drove back to the office in a silence that felt, for the first time, less like restraint and more like two people who both understood exactly what they were choosing not to say. There was another moment that same year, smaller but sharper in memory, at my own father's retirement dinner of all places, a family occasion Arthur had no obvious reason to attend, except that I had mentioned it in passing on a Friday and he had asked, quietly, whether he might come along as a colleague showing support, a phrase we both knew was doing more work than it appeared to. My father liked him instantly, in the uncomplicated way men who've spent their lives with their hands in actual work tend to like other men who've built things. My mother, watching the two of them talk shop about foundations and load-bearing walls, pulled me aside near the dessert table and asked, without any preamble at all, "Is there something between you and your boss?" I told her no, the same lie I told Chloe years later, the same lie I told myself most days. My mother studied my face for a moment, the way mothers do when they've decided not to press an obvious untruth any further, and said only, "Well, he looks at you like there might be," before returning to the table. I have never forgotten that sentence, delivered so lightly, so certainly, by someone who barely knew him at all. I had my own private theories about what any of it meant, and I'll admit them now, though I was never certain of a single one. I thought, some years, that he simply liked training me, and nothing more, and that I had built an entire architecture of longing out of a man's ordinary decency. I thought, other years, that he felt exactly what I felt and had simply decided, long before I arrived. that he would never again let himself want anything that could be taken from him the way Eleanor had been taken. I never asked him which theory was true. I told myself that not asking was a kind of respect. I've since wondered whether it was also, in equal measure, a kind of fear. The obstacle, when it finally surfaced in words instead of silence, came from him directly. And I want to render it honestly, because it was never a villain's excuse. It was the most sympathetic thing he ever told me. It was my 6th year at the firm, after a project celebration dinner where several of us had stayed late at a restaurant near the office, and he walked me to my car in a parking lot lit orange by a single street lamp. He told me, without my asking, that in the last months of Eleanor's illness, she had made him promise her one specific thing. Not that he'd never love again in some abstract sense, but that he would never again build a life around someone he was responsible for guiding, someone whose career could be shaped by whether he chose to love her back. She watched what it did to junior associates at other firms, he told me, office relationships with all the power sitting on one side of the desk. She didn't want that to be my next chapter. She made me promise, and I meant it when I said yes, and I've kept meaning it every year since, even on the years it's cost me something I couldn't tell her about. He told me more that night than he ever had before or since about the specific conversation where Eleanor extracted that promise. A Tuesday afternoon, apparently in a hospital room with a view of a parking garage 3 weeks before she died, when she was lucid enough to be direct about things she wanted settled. She told him she didn't want him to spend the rest of his life alone out of grief, but she also didn't want him to fall into the first available warmth simply because it was near him every day, in an office, with no real choice involved on the other person's side. She used the word unfair, he told me. She said it would be unfair to whoever it was, whether they meant to let it happen or not, because they'd never really know if they'd chosen it freely or just found themselves standing too close to a man who was drowning. I asked him if he thought that described me. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. I think, he finally said, that you've never once given me the impression of someone who didn't know exactly what she was choosing. Every single day, you kept choosing it anyway. It was as close as he ever came, in all our years together, to naming what he believed I felt, and he said it without asking me to confirm or deny a single word of it. I asked him, that night, whether he regretted the promise. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, I regret that keeping it sometimes looks like not caring. I don't regret making it. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said the 4 words that would have changed everything. He opened my car door for me, the way he always did, and we drove home in opposite directions, and the boundary held, the way it always held, because both of us, in that parking lot, chose it on purpose. There was one more scene from that period I should tell you about, because it's the clearest example of the boundary being tested, and both of us choosing, deliberately, not to cross it. 6 months after the parking lot conversation, the firm held its annual gala at the Beacon Plaza Hotel downtown, and at the end of the night, during the last slow song before the band packed up, he asked me to dance, a simple, almost businesslike request, the kind a boss might extend to any long-serving employee at a company function. We danced at arm's length for most of the song, careful, correct, the way 2 colleagues dance. Near the very end, as the song wound down, he drew me in by perhaps 4 inches, not an embrace, nothing anyone watching would have called improper, but close enough that I could feel his heartbeat through his shirt for the first time in 6 years of knowing him. Neither of us said anything. When the song ended, he stepped back, thanked me for the dance in the same tone he used to thank me for the Friday coffee, and walked me to a cab. I sat in that cab replaying those 4 inches for most of the ride home, understanding, for the first time, that whatever he felt was not nothing, and that he had decided, just as deliberately as I had, that nothing further would come of it that night. 4 years later, he retired. It was sudden in the way these things are never actually sudden, a health scare that turned out to be minor but frightening enough to make a man in his late 50s reconsider what he was spending his remaining decades on. He sold his share of the firm to his junior partner Julian Sterling, kept a small consulting arrangement that brought him into the office perhaps once a month, and moved 2 hours north to a coastal house he and Eleanor had bought together 20 years before, and barely used. Our Friday reviews ended without either of us ever formally deciding they should. I told myself in the months after that this was simply what retirement looked like. A slow fade instead of an ending, and I built an entire quiet life around still checking my phone every Friday afternoon, out of habit, long after there was any reason to. The first year after his retirement, he still came in monthly, and those visits became their own small ritual. He'd take me to lunch at the same diner 2 blocks from the office, always the same booth by the window, and we'd talk about ongoing projects for exactly as long as it took to finish the meal. And then, almost without noticing the shift, about everything else for another hour after that. By the second year, the monthly visits had thinned to every other month. By the third, they'd become occasional phone calls, warm but shorter, the natural erosion of a friendship that no longer had an office structure forcing it into regular contact. I told myself each time that this was simply what happens between people whose lives no longer overlap by design. I noticed, without quite admitting it to myself, that I still kept his number pinned at the top of my contacts, still glanced at my phone every Friday at 4 o'clock out of a habit 12 years deep, still bought the same brand of yellow legal pads every January, though I no longer had any reason to. I want to tell you now what I told myself the relationship had been, during those years without him in the building, because it matters for what came later. I told myself it had been mentorship, full stop, an old man teaching a young woman a trade, nothing more, and that the ache I still felt on Friday afternoons was simply the ache of missing a friend. I believed that story well enough to repeat it at my own family's dinner table, 3 years after his retirement, on the night my sister decided to embarrass me in front of everyone we knew. It was our mother's birthday, held at Miriam's house outside Philadelphia. 20-some relatives crowded around 2 pushed-together tables, the kind of dinner where every plate of food comes with an unspoken scoreboard attached. I had flown in the night before. I had, as I always did, brought a card and a modest gift and absolutely no announcement about the fact that I quietly wired our mother's property tax payment every spring, a fact only my mother and her accountant knew, because I did not want credit for something that was simply mine to give. The evening had started well enough. My father told the same 3 stories he always tells at family dinners, the ones about a house he'd rewired badly in his 20s and a customer who'd once paid him entirely in homemade pie. My mother seemed genuinely happy, surrounded by people, the birthday she'd asked for. Miriam had spent the first hour of the party performing her usual hosting routine, rearranging serving dishes that didn't need rearranging, telling my aunt she'd practically redecorated the whole dining room by hand for an event that consisted of 2 folding tables and a tablecloth she'd bought that same week. I let it pass, the way I always let it pass, because correcting Miriam at a family dinner had never once in 34 years produced anything but a longer, more uncomfortable evening for everyone at the table. Miriam stood partway through dessert with a glass of wine in her hand, and in front of both our parents, 3 aunts, and my mother's oldest friend from church, announced that she wanted to say something about poor Elena. "You know," she said, smiling the way she always smiled right before she said something cruel, and called it affection. "We all worried about you for a while there, off in Boston, 34, no husband, no kids, working under some old man for over a decade. I used to tell people you were basically married to your job. Or maybe just married to your boss. Is that still going on, by the way? That whole thing? A few relatives laughed nervously. My mother's smile went thin and brittle. I felt my whole face go hot, 12 years of careful private restraint suddenly on public display as something to be mocked rather than respected. I opened my mouth to answer. I don't even know what I would have said, and that was the exact moment my phone rang. I almost silenced it out of pure instinct. Then, I saw the name on the screen. Julian Sterling, Arthur's former junior partner, now the firm's managing principal, a man who never called me on a Saturday night unless something was genuinely wrong. I excused myself from the table, stepped into Miriam's kitchen, and answered. Julian's voice was careful, the way people's voices get careful right before they tell you something that will reorganize your entire understanding of the past. He told me Arthur had asked him, months earlier, to make this call whenever it felt like the right time, not before. Arthur's exact words, apparently, delivered with the specific caution of a man who did not want his name attached to a gesture he'd never intended anyone to notice. Julian told me that 12 years ago, in my second year at the firm. Arthur had quietly established a private scholarship fund in Eleanor's name, administered entirely outside the firm's own books, and that I had been receiving a portion of my continuing education costs, 2 professional certification exams, and, Julian paused before he said this part, the full remaining balance of my architecture school loans. Paid off 8 years ago in a single anonymous transfer, all funneled through that fund, all completely untraceable back to Arthur unless someone at the firm specifically chose to tell me. I asked Julian how he'd found out, since Arthur had clearly gone to considerable lengths to keep his own name out of it. Julian told me he'd only learned the full extent of it that spring, when Arthur asked him to formalize the fund's paperwork properly, in case anything happens to me before I get around to telling her myself. He said Arthur had specifically instructed him never to volunteer the information unprompted, that if I never asked, if I never needed to know, he was content to let it stay quiet forever. It was, Julian said, almost impossible to get Arthur to agree to make this call at all. He'd only relented after the spring health scare made him reconsider what he wanted left unsaid if his time ran out sooner than expected. I stood in my sister's kitchen holding the phone against my ear, staring at a birthday cake with candles already half melted. And I could not speak for what felt like a full minute. Julian kept going. Gently, he said Arthur had never once let his name appear on a single document related to the fund. He said Arthur had told him, just weeks earlier, before whatever health concern had prompted this call at all, that he wanted me to know eventually, not so she'll feel she owes me anything, Arthur had apparently said, just so she stops thinking 12 years meant nothing, in case I'm not around to tell her myself. I asked Julian, my voice barely holding steady, whether Arthur was all right. Julian said he was, for now, but that the scare from years earlier had recurred in a smaller way that spring, and Arthur had wanted certain things settled regardless of outcome. I walked back into that dining room a different woman than the one who'd walked out of it 4 minutes earlier. Miriam was still holding court, still delighted with the shape of the evening, still waiting for me to laugh off her comment or blush and change the subject the way I always had. I sat back down, and I told them, quietly enough that only the closest half of the table could hear at first, and then loud enough that the rest of them could too, exactly what that phone call had been about, not the 12 years of longing, not the parking lot, not any of what actually lived beneath the surface of it, because that part was never anyone's business but mine and his. I told them only the part that mattered to the room, that the old man she'd mocked me for working under for over a decade had quietly paid off my student loans 8 years ago and never once told me. Never once asked for anything in return, never once let his own name near the paperwork. The table went silent in the exact way tables go silent when a joke has just become a mistake in real time. My mother's face changed first. Miriam's smile finally faltered. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I said, "You spent 12 years assuming the story was that I was pathetic for staying somewhere I wasn't getting anything back. I'd love for you to sit with the fact that you were wrong about what was actually happening the entire time." And then I asked someone to pass the potatoes, because I did not, in that moment, feel like giving the rest of the evening away to her the way I always had. The rest of the dinner proceeded in a strange, careful quiet. My aunt kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between curiosity and reassessment. My father cleared his throat twice and then simply reached over and refilled my water glass without a word, which was, from him, its own kind of apology for years of watching Miriam narrate our family without correction. My mother excused herself to the kitchen not long after, and I found her there, a few minutes later, standing at the sink with her back to the door, not crying exactly, but very still. She turned when she heard me and said only, "I didn't know," which wasn't quite an apology either, but felt, in that moment, like the beginning of one. I told her that was the whole point, nobody had known, because I'd never wanted them to, and that the not knowing had never been anyone's fault but the shape of my own choices. She didn't seem satisfied by that answer, and I understood, watching her face, that she was already beginning to reconsider years of assumptions she'd built about which of her daughters needed protecting, and which one could simply be counted on to absorb whatever came her way. Miriam didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. She left the cleanup to our mother and disappeared upstairs sometime before the last of the relatives had gone, and I drove back to my hotel alone, replaying the whole evening on a loop, unable to fully separate my anger at her from the strange, disorienting warmth of finally understanding what those 12 quiet years had actually contained. I called Arthur 2 days later, once I was back in Boston, once I'd had time to stop shaking every time I thought about it. He picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the ocean in the background, the particular quiet of a place with no traffic. I asked him, directly, why he'd never told me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because telling you felt like asking for something back. And I promised Eleanor I never would." I asked him if Julian was right, if there had been a health scare again this spring. He admitted there had, a smaller one, manageable, but enough to make him think seriously, for the first time, about which parts of the last 12 years he wanted spoken, instead of carried silently to whatever came next. I told him about the dinner, not all of it, not the parts that were mine alone to keep, but enough that he understood what his phone call had actually walked into. He went quiet again, longer this time, and then he said something that surprised me. I almost told Julian not to call at all that night. I sat by this coast for 20 minutes before I let him do it. I kept thinking, what if she hears it, and it changes how she sees the last 12 years, makes it look transactional, like I was buying something instead of just trying to help someone I believed in. I told him it hadn't felt transactional at all. It had felt, I said, like finally being handed the missing piece of a story I'd been telling myself incompletely for over a decade. He exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, the sound of a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying without complaint for a very long time. We didn't resolve anything on that call, not in the way you might want a story like this to resolve. He didn't tell me he loved me. I didn't tell him either. We talked, instead, about the footbridge sketch that got me hired 12 years earlier. About Eleanor's scholarship fund and what he wanted it to become now that it was no longer a secret. About whether I'd come up to the coastal house sometime that fall, the way I used to visit before his retirement quietly ended those visits too. He said yes, he'd like that. I said I would come. Before we hung up, I asked him one more question, the one I'd never had the nerve to ask across a decade of Friday afternoons. I asked him what he'd have said, all those years, if I had simply asked him directly what he felt. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I'd have told you the truth," he finally said, "and then I'd have asked you to forgive me for not being able to act on it. I think some part of me was relieved you never asked, Elena. It meant I never had to hear myself say it out loud and still walk away." I drove up 2 weeks later. We sat on his deck for most of an afternoon, not saying very much, the way people who've spent 12 years saying almost nothing to each other out loud have learned to sit. He'd set 2 mugs of coffee on the small table between our chairs before I even arrived, the same order I'd brought him every Friday for 12 years, remembered and returned without a word about it. At one point, he reached over and adjusted the collar of my jacket against the wind, an ordinary, almost paternal gesture that somehow still carried every unspoken year inside it. And neither of us moved away from it, and neither of us moved toward anything more, either. The waterfront was quiet that afternoon, just the occasional slap of water against the dock posts and a distant boat somewhere across the horizon. He asked, eventually, how the firm was doing without him, and I told him about a project I was leading, a community library 2 towns over, and found myself halfway through describing the structural challenge with its cantilevered reading room, slipping back into exactly the rhythm we'd always had, his questions sharp and specific, mine defensive at first, and then, gradually, grateful for the sharpness. It struck me, sitting there, that this was the thing I had actually missed most in the years since his retirement, not some unspoken romantic possibility, but the specific, irreplaceable experience of being taken seriously by someone whose judgment I trusted completely. "I'm not asking you to wait for anything," he said eventually, looking out at the water instead of at me. "I kept my promise to her because I meant it, and I still mean it. I only wanted you to stop thinking the last 12 years were nothing." I told him they were never nothing. I told him I'd known that the whole time, even without the paperwork, even without the phone call, even without ever being sure exactly what he felt. He nodded and reached over and took my hand, just that, just my hand in his, nothing more. The same restraint we had practiced for over a decade, now sitting quietly between us on a wooden deck instead of across a desk. We stayed like that until the light started to change. The sun dropping low enough that the water turned the color of the legal pads still sitting in my drawer back home. Neither of us mentioned Eleanor again that afternoon, though I think we both understood she was, in some sense, still sitting with us, not as an obstacle any longer, but as the reason either of us had learned, over the years, exactly how to want something without demanding it. Before I left, he told me I was welcome back any time, no occasion required, and I told him I'd hold him to that. I meant it as more than politeness, and I think he understood it that way too. I don't know what happens next between us, and I've stopped needing to know on any particular timeline. What I know is this: my sister spent years assuming my silence about Arthur Vance meant I had nothing worth defending. She learned, over the length of one phone call at our mother's birthday dinner, that some silences are not emptiness at all, they're simply the sound of 2 people choosing, again and again, not to take something they both wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with weakness. I did not walk away from that dinner with a declaration of love. I walked away from it with the truth, finally spoken out loud, and with a boundary that, 12 years later, both of us are still choosing to honor on our own terms, not because anyone forced our hand, but because some things are worth protecting, even after everyone finally knows they exist. Chloe was the first person at the office I told the full story to, once I was back in Boston, and had stopped needing to steady my voice every time I mentioned it. We sat in the same coat closet, half-jokingly, where she'd asked me that question so many years earlier, and I told her everything: the scholarship fund, the loans, the phone call at my sister's table, all of it. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I knew there was something. I just didn't think it would turn out to be this generous." I asked her what she meant. "I always assumed," she said, "that if there was ever a reveal, it would be about how he felt. I never once considered it might be about what he'd quietly done." I told her that was closer to the truth of Arthur Vance than almost anything else I could say about him, that with him, the feeling and the doing had never really been separate things at all, just expressed in whichever form felt safest to offer at the time. I called my mother a week after that dock afternoon, mostly out of habit, and she asked, carefully, whether anything had changed between Arthur and me. I told her the honest answer, not in any way she could put in a sentence to relatives at the next family dinner, and that I'd stopped needing there to be a sentence at all. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me: that she'd always assumed my quietness about him over the years meant I was hiding something shameful, and that she'd never once considered the possibility that I was simply protecting something worth keeping private. I told her that was closer to the truth than anything Miriam had guessed at that table. My mother didn't apologize outright, but she called Miriam that same week, and whatever she said, my sister has not made a joke about my career, my age, or my personal life at a family dinner since. Miriam and I have not fully repaired things, and I don't know if we will. She sent a short message a month later, not quite an apology, more an acknowledgement, saying she hadn't realized how much she didn't know about my life before she decided to narrate it publicly. I told her I appreciated her saying so, and left it there. Some things heal on a longer timeline than a single conversation allows, and I've made peace with that being true of my sister, the same way I've made peace with it being true of Arthur and me. I think about the yellow legal pads sometimes, still stacked in that drawer at home, 12 of them now, one for every year I worked under him before his retirement. I never asked him to explain them, and he never offered to. I understand now that some gestures are only ever meant to be received, not discussed, that naming them out loud would have turned a private language into a public one, and some things are better left in the language they were built in. I think that's true of most of what passed between Arthur and me over those 12 years. It was never a secret because we were ashamed of it. It was a secret because some things only survive if they're allowed to stay quiet a little longer than feels comfortable. Last month, I bought a 13th legal pad, the same brand, without quite deciding to, and left it on my own desk at the office, where a new junior architect I've started mentoring will find it on the anniversary of her first year working under me. I haven't told her why. I don't think I will. Some rituals are worth keeping exactly as private as the ones that taught them to you. I think, now, that restraint was never the absence of love in this story. It was the shape love took when two people decided, over and over, that the other person's dignity mattered more than their own longing. I don't know if Arthur and I will ever close that last distance between us. I know that if we do, it will be because we chose it freely, the way we chose everything else, quietly, on our own time, owing nothing to anyone who ever doubted what those 12 years actually meant. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.